Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and welcome to today's question and answer session, Lean in, Lean out, ethical considerations for reputation of AI in reputation management. Today's session is a part of a series of events that the CIPR are running in support of the Global Alliance Ethics Month. And this is particularly relevant since the CIPR and the CIPR AI and PR committee have been doing some incredible work to raise awareness and set standards, which includes the AI and PR ethics guide. Research shows that the global AI market is expected to contribute up to 15.7 trillion to the global economy in 2030, which is more than the current output of China and India combined. And according to another study, 91.6% of Fortune 1000 companies have begun investing in AI-related technologies. With more than 300 AI principles, frameworks, policies, regulatory initiatives, it is very crucial for everyone to be able to adequately understand what is at play. It is imperative for us as PR practitioners to be aware of the pitfalls and ethics involved, both from an industry perspective and also from a point of view to be able to advise our clients better. To share his insights on the crucial issues surrounding AI in ethics in AI, I'm very excited to introduce our guest today, Anurag Banerjee, co-founder and CEO of Quilt AI. Quilt AI is a mission-first technology company seeking to use the internet as a source of knowledge, inspiration, and communications to tackle issues around climate change, health inequity, and gender inequality. Anurag has spent a decade at American Express and is a Harvard Business School alumnus. And before we get started on the questions, please remember to use hashtags ethics matter when tweeting. Welcome, Anurag.
Thanks, Sudha. Very excited to be here, folks. And like I said at the beginning, all questions are good questions. As a founder of an AI company, I get beat up a lot, including by my kids. So this is I'm always happy to try and defend AI where I can.
So just to get started, we live in a very, very polarized world, and I'll not go into what that polarized means. There are those who believe that AI is good for the world, and the other half who live in fear of the unknown, including me. Is there a middle path? And what is AI for good? What does that mean?
Gosh, so I always start by saying that half the time my Wi-Fi doesn't work, so I'm not worried about AI becoming challenging. But leaving the facetious point aside, I think AI, like any other technology, whether it's nuclear fission or Excel sheets, has both good and bad uses, right? And it's folks like all of us who apply some kind of technology in our lives to the work we do. Our biases form and create challenges in the way AI is deployed in some cases. Of course, there's a middle path. I was just finishing up a session a couple of hours ago around the speed of identifying COVID issues in terms of early young kids across 45 countries using AI as a diagnostics tool. And the entire thing would have been done, probably in more than a year's time using conventional math and conventional techniques. And here the scientists were able to do it in three and a half days. And so so for me, AI is basic math, right? It is, for the most part, what you train it to do, it does. And that comes with a host of other challenges. But of course, there's a middle path, and the sheer number of AI for good things that happen are massive. AI for good includes, better medical treatment, better spotting of issues in your body, better activity around climate. We do a lot of work on gender equity. We do a lot of work on pollution. So
Okay.
I'll pause there to give it back to you.
Yeah. So I think the biggest fear that businesses and customers have is that AI has the capability to make decisions that affect them without their knowledge. And I think this is to do with our understanding at the level of understanding we have. So what is the AI black box problem? And if it is so complicated that the user doesn't understand how it works, how can we trust the decisions that it makes?
Yeah, the AI black box problem is a lot like my dad when he's whining about my mother after being married for 55 years, about not my mom not understanding him, right? And so that's no. So my mom's head is a black box, evidently for my dad, and I think the black box logic is because here's what happens. So I'll take a simple example that I like a lot. At heart, the city I spent most of my time in. So I consider myself a New Yorker. I spent most of my life there. And every time I land at JFK Airport, which I hope happens soon here again, and I head into Manhattan, and there's this glimpse of the city, and I take a photograph there before I hit the bridge. And I probably have like 5,000 of these photographs, and some are rubbish, some are good. Now, imagine if you took all the good photographs of that and you put it in a machine and said, here, now you learn what a good photograph is. So the machine learns how to do that. Now, how it learns is the black box part. But then I take another photograph and I put it in the machine. It says, oh, that's like a 0.78. But that's no different than, in parts the human brain, right? Which is, and I think that worries us more because it's like, wow, we aren't superior anymore. A piece of software can think, but the software truly can't think. My 5-year-old son is smarter than the black box because he knows instinctively not to touch a hot thing. I have to train my AI machine to know that this is a hot glass by making it touch it 10,000 times and telling it it's hot. So the black box is what you don't understand is what we don't understand is the permutation that the machine goes through to acknowledge a good photograph or a hot glass of milk or something else. And that worries people. But it shouldn't, because it's like, how does the computer work? Do we really know? Is the argument I make.
Yeah. Okay.
Do we really know? Or how does a plane fly? But we trust it instinctively, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
you can break pieces down.
You've embraced that technology, and you need to fly and travel and go to JFK. So research shows that consumers believe brands are responsible for the ethical use of AI, and 94% of people believe that if brands can't undertake that responsibility, then government should step in. What is the AI industry doing to bring in transparency around design, data sourcing? Who are the people behind it? And yesterday I read something on LinkedIn by someone from EY who was talking about how can you talk about transparency when you don't know about the ethics of it. So that for the layperson or the person who doesn't understand too much of it, for all of us, I think this is very confusing.
I didn't fully get the question. Is the
So
question?
how do we question how what the data is? How can you bring more transparency into the design? What are AI companies doing to educate the public who uses the products and the services and the automation for various things, that the data is sourced ethically or transparently, and who are the people behind it? And we'll come to questions on bias, because I think the
Sure.
couple of things that
So,
we are grappling with are, yeah.
yeah, thank you. And I don't mean to interrupt you, but I finally understand the question. And so, Sudha, I mean, there are several AI organizations, and Stanford is a great one, OpenAI. There's a bunch of other organizations that are trying very hard to make sure ethical AI or some structure and construct is placed around it. Now, having said that, I think it's an unfair, and I think every technology person says this. So with that sort of disclaimer, I would argue many consumer packaged goods companies don't tell you about how bad the plastic is for the ocean, right? Many banks don't clearly tell you what their fees are. So I think transparency as a construct in capitalism is not always super clear. So having made that broad statement, that honestly, like commercially, transparency has always been challenging. It's not like, try to redeem a set of miles on an airline sometimes, and the exception clauses that come out are super challenging, right? And there isn't a normative structure there. So there are some organizations that are trying to create a set of principles of how AI can be used and what it is used for, how it is to be supervised, how you take bias out, what you input, what makes for a good AI model. but it's early days. And actually, as an AI practitioner, I would love regulation, because you always you have a fast car, and I'm scared that some other fast cars are going to come and bump me. So yes, put me on a road, put the rails up, tell me I can drive at 70 miles an hour, and it's a good thing. So I think regulation has to come almost from other from government and from policy bodies. And as industry, I'd love to participate. I'm going to flip to the social dilemma question here just really quickly.
Yeah.
Social dilemma is not it's basic advertising, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. This thing is listening to you in some shape or form. Having free Facebook has a cost. You get an ad and it surprises you, like, wow, I just did it on WhatsApp and now I have an ad. So there's definitely I think not because technology embraces every part of our life so quickly. And it gets really boring to read the T's and C's whenever we scroll through things. That becomes a bit of a challenge. But
I think
yeah.
lot of it is to do with fear of what we do not understand. But are there some questions that we should be asking to interrogate data sets and algorithms and processes being used?
Yes, I think the four questions that I like being asked always, and I encourage everybody who is being spoken to about an AI-based product, asks these four questions. Question number one, when you say AI, what do you mean, right? Because AI has like a very broad connotation, and it's fashionable to just put a .ai behind something. So to ask that, and almost always the answer is going to be a lot of data computed quickly. Like that's basically it in a very simplistic sense, right? And decisions made based on faster computation, like I think Kerry had up earlier here, which is a very valid point. The second question you want to ask is, okay, if you're able to compute a lot of data about bald men and the choices they make about their shaving cream, how are you training the model to understand what a bald man wants? How many photos of bald men are you putting in there? Are you putting enough photos of white, brown, black, Chinese bald men? I don't think Chinese men are ever bald, but so how are you training your model becomes an important second question. The third is, how has this model been tested in different ways? Like who have you tested this with? It's a question you would ask anybody, right? Like a contractor walks into your house, repairs something, you're going to ask him or her, like, well, who have you worked for? So you get some validity, you start to get a reference. And the fourth one that I like being asked, and I like asking is, if I didn't have this model, could I still run my business? And I think that's a really important question to ask. Everyone's very fascinated with AI. I run an AI company and it pays the bills. But I think the question that all of you and anybody, a brand, a business should ask is, could I actually live without it? Or how would I run my business without it? How would I run my business without Excel or like an accounting software? And do I need it? I don't think it's easy to get bamboozled by cool tech. But I think those four key questions are the right simple ones to start with.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. So you've spoken a bit about bias. Everything that's designed by human beings has bias. As practitioners, again, I keep coming back to the practitioners, because as an industry, I think we are at the position where we, for ourselves, but for our clients also, we have to be vigilant. So how to be vigilant? How can we be vigilant about potential points of bias? And is it possible to prevent or then reduce that bias?
So bias is a bit of a head fake question, because I have bias in everything I do, right? The way I raise my children, the way I teach my kids math, the way I insist on a particular thing, and my wife has a different model and my parents have. So I think it's important actually to have bias. So let me flip it and
Good.
say bias is important, as long as you know what your bias is. I think so being self-aware is far more important, and being aware of the bias you have is far more important. So when we train our machines, one of the things we try to make up for is the lack of female representation in technology and AI. Now, weirdly enough, my company is 72% female. So I have the exact opposite problem. When my colleagues look at data, there's a strong female, millennial, Gen Z lens looking at it. And I'm going like, okay, you've like lost me there halfway through, and that's not how you should treat that. So I think it's really important to know your bias, but you will never be bias free. I think that's that's just not feasible. Every model will have a certain amount of bias, and I think just like you would write a doctoral thesis paper, you would write, here are the sources I looked at. So what informs our model
Yeah.
should be the transparent thing you do. I made my model based on reading these 5 things. I made my model based on these 17 things. And then people are like, oh, I get it. Anurag has this worldview, and because of this worldview, his model's more likely to be X as opposed to Y.
Yeah. No, so you've already touched on, the next question that was going to ask about diversity, because you seem to have the opposite challenge, opposite to the industry, which is like really, really poor on diversity. Some of the biggest companies that do AI and AI technology have very, very poor diversity, whether you talk about female or whether you talk about ethnicity or whether you talk about race diversity. So how that itself skews a lot of the products that they're developing, and they have developed already. Um, how can we address that? And there is no quick way to address that. If you look at gender diversity in the industry, currently we've been trying to address it for decades, and this technology is like it's just coming at super fast speed at us.
Yes, so the thing is that the lack of diversity is amplified because technology, jumps several decades, and in the last 10 months, we've come forward many years in the tech curve. But the lack of diversity hurts, banks and who they give loans to in the US, for sure, which is the market that I know the best. The lack of diversity hurts in the government, hurts on board levels. So it's a well-known fact, right? So I think, again, tarnishing the AI industry by itself is unfair, because like I would look at saying, how many boards actually have the right number of women that they should have, or in senior management or in middle management, right? So, and I'm just using women as a proxy for diversity there, obviously. But I think one thing is true. I think the talent supply issue is a lie, right? Like, I don't run a nonprofit, so I'm seeking to hire the best, smartest people. They just happen to overwhelmingly be women in my case. So the talent supply thing is a myth, and I think people hire the people they're comfortable with, and you have to try to break out of that mold a little bit. I think policy helps. I think some guidelines in the UK I know is more progressive than other parts of the world around some guidelines around board mandates. There's some guidelines in Asia around board mandates, senior management mandates. I think because AI lack of diversity worries people only because the scale of the decisioning can be a bigger factor than it would be, otherwise. But I think that's probably true in the way there's a financial north and a financial south in the world, right? There's the access to loans, access to capital, access to money is just not there for large swaths of economic society because certain decisions were made. So I mean, again, with this, I think models have to be asked for, a body has to be set up, transparency should be demanded, and how do you make sure that you are not choking the capitalist engine, but trying for it to be as equitable as possible. I don't have a good answer on that, except that we try to do our bit and you try to influence as much as you can.
Yeah, yeah. So humanity and human judgment are lost when data and predictive modeling become paramount, right? How can we progress without leaving human beings behind? Is it that human beings will get left behind? This
No,
is
God,
also
no.
a question.
God, no. So, I mean, Elon Musk's an extraordinarily smart guy, so I can't argue with him. And I recognize I'm being recorded here. But I would say this, without the worry of that. As a practitioner of AI, it is humanly inconceivable for me to think about humans being irrelevant, right? And I think there are very smart people who've said the opposite, but this is my point of view. But I think from before the irrelevance happens, I think the worry that people have is of job loss. I mean, look, 15 years ago, there was no job like a social media manager. Like that didn't exist. Now there are thousands of them, and you can't find a good one to save your life. Like content management, search engine optimization, these things didn't exist. So technology companies have become such big employers, by building new technology. And I think the same will happen with AI. I think it'll be a net massive add to the economy. It'll be a net massive add to humans from a talent perspective. And actually, it'll challenge people like me in my 40s to go like, oh shit, pardon me, I've got to like now up my game because last time I learned something was 20 years ago. So I think that's the worrisome part, right? It's like,
Yeah,
oh, I have 20 years to retire, and now a new technology disrupting me, and that is uneasy for us, right? So yeah, it isn't. We're not worried about humanity. We're worried about us at this point in time being
I know.
irrelevant. Um,
I know. Yeah, that's true. I think continuous learning is the way forward, the only way forward in the world that we live. With longer working lives, etc. Is it is it possible for brands to engage authentically with its audiences in an age of AI, and especially with the distrust around technology that we do not understand?
yeah, so I think that there are two questions in that question, and I like this question a lot. So I'm gonna, again, do the controversial thing and say, like, why authenticity? Like, genuinely authenticity is challenging, right? Like, I'm not authentic, and I don't think anybody here is 100% authentic with anybody all the time. Like, that is not. So that, people have got caught up in the idea of like being authentic, and I think the idea is don't be fake, but being
Yeah,
authentic is actually very hard, right? Because then you see what's, and vulnerability is important. I get that, but I think nobody wants to see the authentic side of any of us in this on this call. So similarly with brands, I think brands have to define what is my purpose, how do I best serve my consumer while staying true to my shareholders and while making money. One of my favorite pieces of authenticity actually is the J&J Credo. So for those of you who've read the J&J Credo, you know that it starts with the first duty being to the patients they serve, and the second to employees, and the third to share, and then the final one to shareholders, and the sequence of that. So I think for brands to be authentic, they have to make money to be around, they have to pay employees to be around, and they have to tell something to the consumer for them to buy their products to be around. And they have to do it, I think, not in the most authentic way, but in the most transparent way possible, while seeking to do the least damage. I think that's a better version there. And in terms of using technology, I think you have to embrace technology, because technology has challenged us in the political sphere. AI powered marketing, like the social dilemma example, right,
yeah,
is a good one. So without being political on this, I'm saying AI definitely was used very eloquently and elegantly there. From a technology perspective, I'm not taking sides on this one, but just the use either on Brexit or on the last couple of elections in the US was beautiful. So you have to know it, because it will be used against you if you belong to the other side in some shape or form. It's also used in ways to just understand behavior and patterns, etc. So I think educating yourself is super important for the brand, and then you have to play the game. Like I've been, there's a lot of cool stuff happening with Oatly. So for those of you who are on Twitter, if you've been following Oatly for the last week or so, they've been making some very interesting choice of conversations based on some models. I can tell, I don't know this for a fact, but just the way the decisions are being made and what they're saying. And it's like, wow, this isn't like Oatly, and this is it's confusing. But so clearly they've embraced technology, and they've taken their sort of candid, irreverent nature that you see on their packs to now their Twitter feed, leveraging technology. So I think you have to embrace tech, so you don't get left behind, but you have to do it while seeing like, is this like, it's because everyone doesn't need to be on TikTok, right? Or
yeah.
on Twitter for that matter, but you should at least know how to use it if needed.
Yeah, I can see
Um,
a question, Anurag. Would you like to? Yeah, a couple of questions. Would you just like to have a
Yeah,
quick?
let's do that. So I see a great question from Helen, which is it beautiful if you're fed the message and not seeing other opinions that are realizing you're being forced fed a way of thinking? Helen, that is, that's a beautiful question. I'll tell you why I said it was beautiful. So I'll use a public data point for a minute, and it's a public data point that technically is clever, but to me, from a moral standard, is very challenging. The phrase "lying Hillary" that was used 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, was used after testing it multiple times, and testing
Wow.
it. I think 66 different versions were created, different photographs, Hillary in a brown pantsuit, in a beige pantsuit, in something else, looking a little flustered, and the tag evil Hillary, lying Hillary, like all these were tested, right? And then the ones, and this is like classic comms testing, like everybody on this call probably has done some kind of testing in some shape or form, but they took they took basically digital and like tested it at scale and used it and say, okay, this works, let's double down on it. What I call beautiful there is the use of the technology. Of course, I don't agree with that construct, right? Where you pick the most challenging attributes of a person, and we all have ours, and display that. And being force-fed the opinion, I mean, we all have our filter bubbles. So my filter bubble is, a certain way of voting, and I won't go into that. But it's super pro climate change, super pro like kids being organically fed. So it's that vibe, and all the information I get is that. But it would be good to know something else. So I think the force feeding only happens. It doubles down and reaffirms your set of beliefs. And if you don't have a tight filter bubble, then you will get this force fed. But that's like advertising, right? You see ads on TV, you see ads in newspapers, you see ads on print. Why shouldn't you see an ad on Facebook, right? I think it's also important on us to judge something and use our human brains. Like the amount of forwards that humanity does on as a whole is just stupefying.
Falling.
I'm going to jump to the next question with Irina, which is a cool question. AI is a very good tool for big data analysis, but could not be allowed to take decisions, especially in the policy matter. So I think a couple of conversations we've where I've been part of the super periphery in the U.S. Congress decisions, and I've contributed to certain think tanks, and they've presented cases. I think AI is not being used it's being used to crunch data in many cases. I think NHS uses it really well on several things. Many other hospital systems use it, etc. But governments aren't yet at scale. There are a few applications obviously, but at scale using it to talk about implementing policy changes. I think that was a question. But the discussions are actually more around like, how do we know this is true? Yep, Kerry, I'm loving your narrative coming through. That's fantastic. Sudha, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question we come to is, the biggest players are China, US, and EU, the biggest investors in AI research and technology. The technology has huge potential to concentrate power in some hands and leave others behind, because not everybody is investing in it. I mean, some people don't have the bandwidth to do that. How can we democratize access to the technology for the larger good? And is it possible? Is it happening already?
Yes, I think, look, the last 8 months have been very troubling for those of us who believe in more equality. The income inequality, and you all know this, so I'm going to be very brief here. The income inequality is massive. Most of us who own homes or multiple homes have had our mortgage rates slashed, right? And our stock portfolios have done ridiculously well. At the same time, tens of millions of people are out of jobs. And you see this like yawning happening. It's obviously disproportionately affected women. I think 9 cents in the dollar has been lost in the last year that's happened. In terms of democratizing, I think that is hard to happen. If I think of the technology world today, there's Facebook, Google, Amazon, Netflix, Disney Plus, Microsoft. There's a massive concentration, and power is concentrated like that in every industry. It's the same thing with banks, right? It's the same thing with retail chains. The same thing with the food we eat, right? It comes from 3 players in the world. The entire food we eat in some shape, from 90% of it comes from 3 large players in the world. So concentration is always going to happen. The issue is like these capitalist barons, how are they going to make sure that there's no disproportionate impact that happens? And I think that's the harder part to think through. Like the tobacco companies, right, aren't stopping selling tobacco. And if you take away technology companies for a second, the best performing companies on a stock potential issue in the last 20 years are all the technology, all the tobacco companies. Um, and they employ a lot of people and pay a lot of livelihoods. But I would stop that before I stop. I would democratize that and do health before I'd worry about like the vague possibility of AI being challenging. And Helen, to your question about fighting back, I think that's on us. I think it's really important for every one of us to ensure we get a wider view. I think we like and surround ourselves with people we like and think like. We like and surround ourselves with ideas that we like and think like, that echoes our filter bubbles. So it's actually really hard. It's really hard for somebody to say, I don't want, I want to embrace the other side. And it's not normatively who we are as tribal people. We stick to a model of thinking. So it upsets us that the other tribes sometimes win.
Yeah, what I so concur with what you're saying, Anurag. I noticed that in the media that we consume. I listen to CNN or BBC and Fox. I have started intentionally to looking at and hearing what they're saying there, because it should inform our decision making process. And even in the print media, I'd never look at Daily Mail, but I have started looking at it because there is a lot of stuff in there that we should know about. I think human beings are designed. The more you're thinking about diversity, the less the more closed you are becoming in your own, what do you say, thinking, and the way you think and the way you consume data and media. Is there privacy in the AI world? Is that possible at all? From all sorts of perspectives.
I mean, of course there is. I think actually, whether it's rules like the GDPR law, which I think is fantastic, or there are some other laws that Singapore has a really cool data privacy law. The US is a little behind. I think privacy is where the fight will be fought. But honestly, I think there's a value privacy continuum, right? So if you get value by giving up data, like so you get like in the US you get a mortgage based on credit score, based on data points that you've shared, right? Over a period of time, what you buy, how much money you make, how much money you pay back. So that like, oh, Mr. Banerjee, we can now give you a mortgage, which is great. Same thing with airline miles. You get a benefit, you give us some privacy there, and so on and so forth. And I think with technology, we are using many of these tools for free. The question is, what fee would we be willing to pay, and where, and do we get value, and how much of it is really harassing us? We like the Google auto prompt; it works for us. We like the AI that finishes our email. It's kind of spooky, but I'm like, wow, that just saved me some time. It now knows how I write. So I think I get value, and I'm okay giving up certain parts of privacy. Obviously, not okay giving up some other parts. And we all have to make our own individual decisions on that. And I think the good news is we can. There are ways for you and me to operate differently in the digital world today and get different value from that.
Okay, so while there is a race for investment and research in AI, and people forget that computations use matter and consume huge amounts of energy, they leave a big carbon footprint from all this accelerated growth. Considering climate change imperatives, how are companies prepared to offset that? We're at one level, you're talking about global warming and the different issues and energy consumption, and on the other side you have this technology that is accelerating at like huge rates, and it is going to it's like a guzzler, right? How do we address that? How's the industry prepared or preparing to offset that?
They're not. I know I'm not. I think it's a massive issue, right? It's an absolute massive issue. But in the scheme of things, right? If you just map out like the way the carbon existence is in the world, the number one by far is eating meat. So AI data centers and costs associated with that are less than 2% of the impact and 54% of the impact on the planet is eating meat. So every time I have a burger, I'm like, oh goodness gracious! I just I worry more about that than I worry about, and that 2% will increase for sure. But if all of us had to do one thing, is sending 5 less emails is not going to be as effective as eating one less one less steak or chicken or something else. So that's my little push for the planet.
Okay, that's your push, but there's no answers currently within the industry and anything that is taking place.
Nothing,
Um,
nothing, nothing massive or meaningful, right? For sure.
Something to think about, probably.
Yes.
We've been speaking about ethics and ethical standards. Who's responsible for establishing and enforcing? I know the EU is doing something, and US is doing something, and I can see Kerry's question, which is really, really interesting. So if you could just talk about ethical standards and then go to Kerry's question.
Yeah, I think again, this is it's a starfish analogy that I use, right? I'm like, there can be policy and government should be involved, etc. But if you just saw the questioning that was done for the tech firms by the US Congress, you're like, my goodness, like there's so many more detailed questions need to have been asked, regardless of where you sit politically on the spectrum. But to answer Kerry's question, one of the things that we do in a very small way, we're a small organization, is we hold data camps and we hold data literacy awareness, and we talk to people about how digital media works and how privacy works and how you need to protect your data or give your data. So we run those on a pro bono basis. I'm happy to run them for any of your organizations on a pro bono basis. We ask for a donation to a charity of our choice or a charity of your choice, right? But that's the way we come at it. So that every organization, and we do this with small NGOs, large NGOs, some small companies. We did something recently for a Fortune 50 company. They had 400 of their marketing folks listening into us talking about data privacy and challenges. So it's a slow process, but Luis's question is, what do you think about chatbots? Is it fair, ethical that people think? Of course not. I despise chatbots, Louise. I think it's like terrible. When I really like talking, you can tell I like talking to people. But no, so I'm on that. I'm like, no, it's a terrible thing.
But
It's
what
just that
about
I'm
the
a machine,
industry?
and if you really need to talk to a person, like hit the number 2, and I'll connect you to somebody in 20 minutes. But it should be clear. I think that's I dislike that
So is the industry doing something to create transparency around that, around this
on
chatbot?
chatbots.
Yeah.
No, but I think with chatbots,
Or is it
my
something people have to demand?
yeah, I think two things, right? I think as consumers we wield enormous power, and I would not to be activistic about it, but I would urge you, like, what is one thing that you will do on data privacy when you leave this call, right? Are you going to write a letter? Are you going to write to your rep? Like, funnily enough, change happens like that, right? So if you feel good about it and we have a cocktail and we talk about it, but then we go back and nothing happens, then we've lost the plot. So I would say, what is the industry doing? Like, do something. Send a letter tomorrow. I'll tell you who to write to. I'll send it to you so that we can share it about like demanding transparency on chatbots. I think that would be epic.
Brilliant. The final question. Professor Bostrom from Future of Humanity Institute suggests that AI could overtake humanity by 2045. And Google's director of engineering says the same, right? What does this mean? It'll take over him. How can we start preparing as PR practitioners, as clients, as just people generally who are going to be faced with this enormous enormity that is happening?
Yes, I'm gonna add in, take that question, link in Kerry's about Zoom. And yes, Zoom is, I mean, Eric is a great CEO, runs a great company, but obviously data is being collected. You've said yes to giving the data. And with Elizabeth's question, what tools you recommend, so I'll come to that second. Look, I'm not as qualified as the guy who runs engineering at Google, obviously, and certainly not a professor by any stretch. But my viewpoint is, I don't know enough to decide if they are right or wrong. What I do know, what little I do know, tells me that that is not going to be accurate. And AI taking over humanity is like, what does that mean? Like, do we die? Do we disappear? Are all jobs done by them? Yeah. So I've read a lot of, Our Last Invention is a great book I read recently, but it puts together different data points in a bad way and talks about AI taking over. So to the best of my knowledge, not going to happen for 100 years at the current pace of technological progress. And Elizabeth, to answer your question, what AI tools you recommend, I think more than the AI tools you recommend, I think the question you want to ask are the following as PR practitioners or comms practitioners. When I'm communicating my point of view as a brand, what technology can be used to stunt that, or what can be used to propose that? That's one, right? The second is, when I'm communicating to my consumers, what is the world they live in? How do I live in their same world, and how do I communicate to them more effectively? And I would urge you to think about your personal life, and if any of you has a teenager who's really good on the internet, like figure out like how they use it, and then apply that there. So there isn't really an AI tool, Elizabeth, to your question. I have a couple other questions, and Tim is legal sector, AI-led chatbots. Maybe the term chatbots unhelpful here. I think chat trees are really useful. I think collecting base information, Tim, actually is super useful. And in the legal space, I see some really cool legal AI startups that are taking some very simple work, right? Like a basic term sheet or a shareholder agreement, and able to swap a few things out and push that out. My wife's a lawyer, and I know she's annoyed about that, but there's some cool stuff there. William, your question is around practitioners thinking of being the conscience. How do you prepare yourself? Yeah, so I mean, again, I think with this, I would deal with it. So leave AI out of it for a second, right? Deal with it the same way as you would, like, because the issue is always going to be a business issue. Somebody did something, using AI would be the sort of clincher. But eventually, if you have a marketing team, they may have spammed people without getting permission, but using an AI tool, right? If you are a procurement organization, you may have optimized payment terms in a certainly complicated way and hurt some small vendors without meaning to, because you're optimizing, because the AI was optimizing your days payable outstanding. So I think translate it into business issues and see, are any of these business issues then applying AI? So is there an AI accelerator in that issue? And when you find that, then you need to ask the question, like, what can go wrong in this acceleration? Spamming employees, paying vendors late. I'm just using simple examples there. But that's the way I'd go at it, Will.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Any more questions? Carrie, do you have any more questions that you'd like to ask?
No, I don't think so. Just a big thank you to Sudha and to Anurag and everyone joining you, Sudha. Because the more people that talk about it, it starts to demystify it, and more people go on the upskilling journey. But it's not easy, because as some of the areas that we discussed here, particularly ethical considerations, there is now a call for bespoke ethics every time we're getting into people behaviours and all kinds of, philosophy, moral models, data and maths, which aren't traditionally our skill set. So big thank you, Sudha and Anurag, and well done.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Anurag, any last words?
No, I mean, I think I'd love to host, pro bono AI data specific sessions at. So if there's a need, do let us know. I think education is important in the industry, so we're happy to support that. Outside of that, don't worry too much, guys. The world isn't going to get taken over, I assure you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.